The photograph wasn't supposed to be there. Joan's hands tremble as Carl appears in the doorway, catching her flushed and guilty in his private office. His dark eyes assess everything, her racing pulse, the drawer left open, the truth she can't hide. One question changes everything. What are you doing in here? Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. The photograph wasn't supposed to be there. Joan Martinez hadn't meant to open that drawer in Carl Bennett's home office, hadn't meant to discover anything beyond the printer paper she'd been sent to fetch. But there it was, tucked between reams of white sheets, a candid photo from what looked like a beach vacation years ago. Carl, younger but unmistakably him, his dark skin gleaming with seawater, his broad shoulders relaxed in a way she'd never seen them, his smile unguarded and genuine. The kind of smile that transformed his entire face from the careful, controlled single father she knew into someone who looked like he still believed in joy. Joan's fingers trembled as she held the photograph, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. She was 23 years old, fresh out of college with a degree in early childhood education and absolutely no business feeling this way about her employer. Yet here she stood in his empty office at 2 p.m, staring at an old photograph like it held answers to questions she shouldn't be asking. The heat that bloomed in her cheeks had nothing to do with the summer temperature and everything to do with the realization that she'd been thinking about Carl Bennett far too much for far too long. She'd been working for the Bennett family for 6 months now, ever since Carl had hired her to watch his daughter Mia after school and during his increasingly demanding work schedule as a senior architect at one of the city's most prestigious firms. 6 months of arriving at 3:30 to pick up Mia from kindergarten. 6 months of helping with homework and preparing dinners. 6 months of carefully maintained professional distance that was becoming harder to maintain with each passing day. The house around her spoke of a man trying to build stability from the wreckage of loss. Carl's wife had died 3 years ago, cancer that had moved too fast for treatments to catch, leaving him alone with a then 2-year-old daughter and a world that suddenly made no sense. The photos throughout the house told that story, a beautiful black woman with kind eyes and Mia's exact smile, frozen in moments of happiness that had ended too soon. Joan had learned not to stare at those pictures, had trained herself to see them as part of the landscape, rather than reminders of the woman whose shoes she could never fill, whose memory still filled every corner of this carefully maintained home. She shouldn't be here, shouldn't be in Carl's private office, shouldn't be holding this photograph like it was precious. But her fingers wouldn't release it, and her mind wouldn't stop cataloging details. The way water droplets caught on his chest, the lean strength of his frame, the absolute confidence in his posture that spoke of a man who hadn't yet learned that life could break you in ways you never recovered from. Joan forced herself to put the photograph back, but her hands were shaking now, her breath coming faster than it should. She pressed her palms against the cool wood of the desk, trying to center herself, trying to remember all the reasons this dangerous fascination was impossible, inappropriate, destined for disaster. Carl was her employer, a widower still grieving, a father focused entirely on his daughter's well-being. She was the help, barely more than a kid herself, someone he trusted to care for his child, but certainly not someone he saw as anything beyond that role. The boundaries were clear, necessary, absolute. So why did her body refuse to acknowledge them? Why did her pulse quicken every time he came home, still in his work clothes, his tie loosened and the first button of his shirt undone, looking exhausted and beautiful and utterly untouchable? Why did she find excuses to stay later than necessary, helping with dishes or folding laundry, just to be in his presence a little longer? Why did she lie awake at night in her small apartment, thinking about the way his voice softened when he read to Mia, the gentle competence of his hands as he braided his daughter's hair, the rare moments when his guard dropped and she glimpsed the man beneath the armor of responsibility? Joan heard the front door open downstairs and panic flooded her system. Carl wasn't supposed to be home for another 2 hours. She'd timed this perfectly, had Mia settled with her favorite movie and snacks, had told herself she just needed printer paper to print out the coloring sheets Mia had requested. But Carl's distinctive footsteps were already on the stairs, and Joan was still standing in his office, flushed and guilty and completely unprepared to face him. She grabbed the printer paper with shaking hands, but it was too late. Carl appeared in the doorway, and the look on his face made her stomach drop. He'd clearly come home to grab something he'd forgotten, was already stressed about whatever had pulled him away from work, and now he found his babysitter emerging from his private office looking like she'd been caught stealing. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Joan saw the exact second when Carl's expression shifted from surprise to assessment, his dark eyes taking in her flushed cheeks, her trembling hands, the way she couldn't quite meet his gaze. She watched him glance at the desk behind her, at the drawer she'd left slightly open, and felt heat crawl up her neck with humiliating intensity. This was it. She was fired. She'd violated his privacy, crossed a line she had no business approaching, and now she'd lose not just her job, but her chance. To be near him, to see Mia, to exist in the orbit of this family that had somehow become the center of her world. Carl Bennett, at 35, had learned to read people with the same precision he brought to architectural design. You didn't survive 3 years of single fatherhood, didn't navigate the minefield of grief while raising a small child, didn't rebuild your life from nothing without developing the ability to see what people weren't saying. And right now, Joan Martinez was not saying a great many things that her body was screaming loud and clear. He'd noticed her, of course. You'd have to be dead not to notice Joan, with her warm brown eyes and the curves her modest clothing couldn't quite hide, with her patient way with Mia, and the competence she brought to every task. He'd noticed the way she bit her lower lip when she was concentrating, the musical quality of her laugh when Mia said something funny, the grace in her movements as she navigated his kitchen like she'd always belonged there. He'd noticed, and he'd very deliberately done nothing about noticing, because Joan was 23 to his 35, was his employee, was someone who deserved better than a broken widower with a child, and a heart he wasn't sure would ever fully work again. But standing in his office doorway, watching her emerge looking guilty and flushed and absolutely beautiful in her nervousness, Carl felt something shift inside him. Something he'd thought had died with his wife, something he'd convinced himself he'd never feel again. Want, pure, uncomplicated, undeniable want. "Joan," he said, and his voice came out rougher than intended. "What are you doing in here?" The question was reasonable, professional, exactly what an employer should ask. But the way her eyes widened at his tone, the way her breath caught audibly, the way she seemed to shrink and expand simultaneously under his gaze, that wasn't professional at all. That was something else entirely. "I needed printer paper," she managed, holding up the ream like evidence in her defense. "For Mia's coloring sheets." "You said I could use the office printer. I'm sorry. I should have waited until you were home. I didn't mean to invade your privacy. She was babbling now, words tumbling over each other, and Carl found himself taking a step into the room without consciously deciding to move. He watched her track his movement, watched her throat work as she swallowed, watched the paper in her hands tremble slightly. The air between them felt suddenly charged, heavy with something neither of them was acknowledging, but both of them were feeling. "It's fine," Carl said, but he didn't move back. Instead, he found himself moving closer, drawn by something he didn't want to examine too closely. "You're always welcome to use whatever you need." "That's not," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "That's not what I'm concerned about." Joan's eyes met his finally, and what he saw there made his breath catch. Confusion and desire and fear and hope, all tangled together in an expression so honest it bypassed every defense he'd carefully constructed. She was young, yes, but not naive. She was looking at him like she saw him, really saw him, not just the grieving widower or the dedicated father or the successful architect, but the man underneath all those roles. The man who was tired of being alone, tired of being strong, tired of pretending that physical need didn't still exist just because emotional availability felt impossible. "What are you concerned about?" Joan whispered, and the question hung between them like a dare. Carl knew he should step back, should reinforce the boundaries that were blurring dangerously with every second they stood here in this small space. Should remember that Mia was downstairs, that Joan was his employee, that acting on this magnetic pull would complicate everything in ways he wasn't sure either of them could handle. But his wife had been dead for 3 years. 3 years of celibacy, of focusing entirely on Mia, of convincing himself that part of his life was over. 3 years of pretending he didn't notice beautiful women, didn't feel the ache of loneliness in the middle of the night, didn't wonder what it would be like to be touched again with desire instead of pity. And Joan wasn't just any beautiful woman. She was patient and kind, brilliant with his daughter, capable and competent in ways that made his carefully controlled household run smoothly. She was also looking at him right now like he was the answer to a question she'd been too afraid to ask out loud. "I'm concerned," Carl said slowly, taking another step closer, "that you're in my office looking guilty about something that has nothing to do with printer paper." Joan's breath hitched audibly. Her back was against his desk now, nowhere left to retreat. The paper fell from her hands, forgotten, as Carl moved into her space with deliberate intent. He could see her pulse fluttering at the base of her throat, could smell the light floral scent of her shampoo, could feel the heat radiating from her body in the small distance that remained between them. He was close enough now to see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, close enough to notice the way her pupils dilated as he approached, close enough that if he leaned forward just slightly, he could— "Stop," he told himself. "This is insane. She works for you. She trusts you. You're taking advantage of a power dynamic that makes this inherently wrong." But then Joan's hand moved, trembling but deliberate, reaching up to touch his chest through his dress shirt. The contact was feather-light, barely there, but it burned through the fabric like a brand. Carl caught her wrist gently, but he didn't push her hand away. Instead, he found himself holding it there, pressed against his heart, which was racing in a way that had nothing to do with his interrupted workday, and everything to do with the woman in front of him. "We shouldn't," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I know," Joan whispered back. But the way she was looking at him suggested she knew a lot more than he'd given her credit for. Suggested that maybe this wasn't as one-sided as he'd assumed, that maybe she'd been fighting the same battle he had, that maybe they were both tired of pretending. "Mia's downstairs," Carl tried again, grasping for the responsibility that usually anchored him. "Watching a movie," Joan replied. "She won't need anything for at least 45 minutes. The specificity of that answer, the implication that Joan had planned for this possibility even if she hadn't consciously acknowledged it, sent heat flooding through Carl's body. His thumb moved against her wrist, finding her pulse point, feeling the rapid flutter that matched his own. "You're young," he said, but it sounded like an excuse even to his own ears. "I'm 23, not a child," Joan countered, "and I know exactly what I want." The boldness of the statement, delivered in that slightly breathless voice, nearly undid him. Carl's free hand moved without permission, cupping her face, his thumb brushing across her lower lip. Joan's eyes fluttered closed at the contact, a soft sound escaping her throat that went straight to parts of him that had been dormant for too long. "This is a terrible idea," Carl murmured, but he was already leaning in, already closing the distance between them, already giving in to something that felt inevitable, despite being completely impossible. "Then stop me," Joan challenged, opening her eyes to meet his gaze directly. "Tell me you don't want this, and I'll never mention it again. I'll go back to being just the babysitter. We'll pretend this never happened." But she said it like she knew he couldn't, like she could see right through every defense he'd constructed, like she understood that he was already lost. Carl's control, the iron will that had gotten him through 3 years of single parenthood, shattered completely. His mouth found hers with a hunger that should have terrified him, but instead felt like coming home after a long exile. Joan responded immediately, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing against his with a need that matched his own. The kiss was nothing like gentle. It was desperate and consuming, 3 years of loneliness and 6 months of denied attraction pouring out in a connection that felt both brand new and achingly familiar. Carl's hands moved to her waist, lifting her onto the desk without breaking contact, stepping between her legs in a movement that felt choreographed, despite being completely spontaneous. Joan's fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, making small sounds of pleasure that destroyed any remaining pretense of restraint. She kissed like she was trying to memorize him, like she'd been starving and he was sustenance, like this moment was both beginning and ending, and she needed to capture every second. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Carl rested his forehead against hers. His hands were shaking where they gripped her waist, his entire body alive in a way he'd forgotten was possible. Joan's legs were wrapped around him, her fingers still tangled in his hair, her chest rising and falling rapidly against his. "We can't," Carl started, but Joan cut him off. "I know all the reasons why we shouldn't," she said quietly. "You're my employer. You're grieving. There's Mia to think about. There's a 12-year age gap. But Carl, I've been thinking about you for months. I've tried to stop. I've tried to be professional. I've tried to convince myself this is just a crush, just attraction, just anything that would make it go away. But it's not going away. If anything, it's getting stronger." Carl pulled back enough to look at her properly. Her lips were swollen from his kiss, her hair mussed from his hands, her eyes bright with emotion and desire. She looked young and beautiful and absolutely certain in a way that made his chest ache. "I'm a mess," he said honestly. "I'm still figuring out how to be a single father. I work too much. I have a daughter who has to come first, always. I don't know if I have anything left to give anyone else, if I can be what someone like you deserves." Joan's hands moved to frame his face, forcing him to maintain eye contact. "I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm not asking for promises you can't keep. I'm just asking you to acknowledge that this exists, that it's real, that maybe we could explore it carefully without anyone getting hurt." Carl wanted to argue, wanted to point out all the ways people absolutely could get hurt, would get hurt, were probably already getting hurt. But looking into Joan's eyes, feeling her warmth against him, tasting her on his lips, it was impossible to deny that she was right. This was real. This existed. And pretending otherwise wasn't protecting either of them anymore. "Okay," he said finally, but slowly, carefully. "Mia can never know until we're sure this is something real, something that could last. And if at any point you feel uncomfortable, if the power dynamic becomes a problem, you tell me, and we stop immediately." Joan nodded, relief and excitement flooding her expression. Slowly, she agreed. Carefully. They separated reluctantly, both acutely aware of Mia downstairs, of the boundaries they'd just crossed, of the impossible territory they were now navigating. Carl helped Joan off the desk, steadying her when her legs proved slightly unsteady, trying not to feel too satisfied by that physical evidence of her desire. But before she could leave the office, Carl caught her hand one more time. "Joan, one more thing." She turned back, eyebrows raised in question. "Whatever you were doing in here before I came home, whatever had you looking so guilty," he paused, searching for the right words. "I need you to know that I see you, not just as Mia's babysitter, not just as the help. I see you." Joan's eyes filled with tears that she blinked back, quickly. "That's all I wanted," she whispered, "for you to see me." After she left, Carl stood in his office for a long moment, trying to process what had just happened, what he'd just started, what it might mean for all of them. The photograph was still in the drawer, a reminder of simpler times when love seemed straightforward and loss was something that happened to other people. But life was different now. He was different now. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop living in the past and start building something new. Even if that something new was complicated and risky and absolutely terrifying. Downstairs, he found Joan and Mia curled up on the couch together, watching the movie like nothing had changed. But when Joan glanced up at him, her eyes held a promise that made his heart race all over again. Everything had changed. They just had to figure out how to navigate it without destroying what mattered most. The following weeks developed a rhythm that was both thrilling and terrifying. Carl and Joan began a carefully choreographed dance of stolen moments and unspoken understanding, finding ways to connect while maintaining the facade of professional distance whenever Mia was present. It started small, hands brushing when passing dishes at dinner, eye contact held just a moment too long, conversations that continued after Mia went to bed under the guise of discussing schedules and household needs, but really serving as excuses to be near each other. Carl found himself coming home earlier, manufacturing reasons to be there while Joan was still working, telling himself it was about spending more time with Mia, when really it was about the way his daughter's laughter sounded different when Joan was the one eliciting it, about the way his house felt like a home again instead of just a museum to loss. Joan began arriving earlier too, showing up 30 minutes before she needed to pick up Mia from school, helping with meal prep and laundry and all the domestic tasks that Carl had been managing alone for 3 years. She integrated into their lives seamlessly, not trying to replace the mother Mia had lost, but creating her own space in their family dynamic. Mia adored her, that was clear, but more than that, Mia trusted her, relied on her, looked to her with the kind of affection that both warmed Carl's heart and terrified him. Because what happened if this thing between them fell apart? What happened to his daughter when the woman she'd grown attached to disappeared because her father couldn't keep his hands to himself? The guilt was constant, warring with desire that refused to be contained by logic or responsibility. Late one evening, after Mia had fallen asleep on the couch during their movie night, Carl carried his daughter upstairs while Joan tidied the living room. When he came back down, he found her folding the throw blankets with meticulous care, her movements efficient but not hurried. She didn't look up when he entered, but he saw her, shoulders tense slightly, awareness rippling through her body at his presence. "You don't have to do that," Carl said quietly, moving into the room. "It's late. You should go home." Joan paused in her folding, finally turning to face him. "What if I don't want to go home?" The question hung between them, loaded with possibility and danger. They'd been good for weeks, had maintained their boundaries, had kept their interactions appropriate. But the tension had been building, pressure accumulating with every denied touch, every interrupted moment, every night they spent apart when all they wanted was to be together. "Joan," Carl started, but she cut him off. "I know what you're going to say. We need to be careful. We need to think of Mia. We need to go slow." She set the blanket down and crossed to where he stood. "But Carl, going slow is killing me. I think about you constantly. I lie awake wondering what it would be like if I could just stay here, if I didn't have to leave every night, if we could be a real family instead of this complicated thing we're dancing around." Carl's hands found her waist automatically, pulling her closer, even as his brain screamed warnings about appropriate behavior and professional boundaries. "You're 23, he said, but his voice lacked the conviction it should have carried. "You should be out with friends, dating people your own age, not playing house with a widower and his kid. Is that what you think I'm doing?" "Playing house?" Joan's eyes flashed with hurt and anger. "Because that's insulting. I care about Mia. I care about you. This isn't some fantasy I'm living out. This is real for me." "I know," Carl said quickly, his thumbs rubbing soothing circles on her hips. "I know it's real. I can feel how real it is. That's what scares me." Joan's expression softened slightly. "What scares you?" That I'll hurt you? That this won't last? That I'm too young or too inexperienced or too whatever other excuse you've invented? Carl pulled her flush against him, letting her feel the effect she had on him, the undeniable physical response that made denials pointless. Does this feel like I think you're too anything? His voice dropped to a rough whisper. I'm scared because I want you so badly I can barely function. I'm scared because my daughter looks at you like you hung the moon. I'm scared because this could be everything, or it could be a disaster, and I have no idea which until we're already in too deep to walk away unscathed. Joan's arms wrapped around his neck, her body fitting against his like it had been designed for exactly this purpose. Then maybe we stop being scared and just see where this goes. Maybe we trust that we're both adults who can make our own decisions. Maybe we believe that wanting someone isn't inherently wrong just because the timing is complicated. Carl knew he should resist, should be the responsible one, should protect her from his brokenness and his complications. But looking into her eyes, feeling her warmth, against him, tasting the possibility of something good after years of just surviving, his resistance crumbled completely. The kiss was different this time, less desperate, more deliberate, a conscious choice rather than an impulsive surrender. Carl took his time, learning the shape of her mouth, the sound she made when he touched her in specific ways, the places that made her breath catch and her fingers tighten in his hair. Joan responded with equal attention, her hands mapping the muscles of his back through his shirt, her body pressing closer when he deepened the kiss, her small sounds of pleasure driving him toward the edge of control. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Carl rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he whispered. "Tonight. Just stay. I can't promise anything beyond tonight, can't guarantee this won't blow up in our faces, but God, Joan, I need you to stay." Joan's answer was another kiss, this one soft and sweet and full of promises neither of them had the right to make. "Yes," she breathed against his lips. "Yes." They moved upstairs with quiet urgency, careful not to wake Mia, whose room was at the opposite end of the hall from Carl's. Every step felt weighted with significance, with the knowledge that crossing this threshold would change everything, that there would be no going back to the careful distance they'd maintained. Carl's bedroom was masculine and sparse, nothing like the family space downstairs. His late wife's presence was notably absent here, photos removed years ago when sleeping in their shared space became unbearable. It was just his now, and that felt important somehow, felt like permission to move forward instead of remaining trapped in the past. Joan stood in the middle of the room, suddenly uncertain now that the moment had arrived. Carl crossed to her slowly, giving her time to change her mind, to recognize the magnitude of what they were about to do. But she didn't retreat. Instead, she reached for him, her hands shaking slightly as they found the buttons of his shirt. "We don't have to rush," Carl said gently, covering her trembling hands with his own. "We can just sleep. We can take all the time you need." Joan looked up at him, eyes bright with emotion. "I've been ready for this for months. I'm just nervous because I want it to be perfect, want to be enough for you." Carl cupped her face tenderly. "You're already enough. You're more than enough." What happened next was tender and consuming, exploration and affirmation, two people learning each other with patience and care. Carl took his time, mapping every inch of skin revealed as clothing fell away, finding the places that made Joan gasp and arch into his touch. She was responsive and honest, not hiding her pleasure or her inexperience, trusting him to guide her through territory that was new to both of them in different ways. The physical connection was powerful, yes, but it was the emotional intimacy that undid them both. The way Joan looked at him with complete trust, the way Carl held her like she was precious, the way they moved together with a synchronicity that suggested this was always meant to happen. When they finally came together completely, Joan's eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with discomfort and everything to do with the overwhelming rightness of the moment. Carl moved with careful deliberation, watching her face, adjusting to her needs, making sure every sensation brought pleasure rather than pain. Joan clung to him, her nails digging into his shoulders, her voice breaking on his name as she discovered what her body was capable of feeling. The world narrowed to just them, just this moment, just the connection that felt both brand new and ancient. Afterward, they lay tangled together, hearts still racing, hands still seeking contact, even in the aftermath. Carl pulled the blanket over them both, tucking Joan against his side, where she fit perfectly. Her head rested on his chest, right over his heart, her fingers tracing idle patterns on his skin. "I love you," Joan whispered into the darkness, the confession spilling out before she could stop it. "I know I shouldn't. I know it's too soon. I know it complicates everything. But I do." Carl's arms tightened around her. The words he should say, the cautions he should offer, the reality checks he should provide, all of it evaporated in the face of what he felt holding her. "I love you too," he admitted. "God help us both. I love you too." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, pretending for a few hours that the complications didn't exist, that love was enough, that wanting each other wasn't dangerous to everyone involved. But morning would come with all its realities, and then they'd have to figure out how to navigate a relationship that had started in secrecy and now demanded acknowledgement. The next morning arrived with sunlight and the sound of small footsteps in the hallway. Carl woke instantly, years of single parenthood making him attuned to every sound his daughter made. Joan stirred beside him, disoriented for a moment before memory flooded back and panic flashed across her face. "Mia," she whispered urgently. "I should leave. I shouldn't be here when she wakes up. This was a mistake." Carl caught her hand before she could bolt. "Wait, just wait. We need to talk about this, figure out how to handle it, instead of just reacting." But there was no time for discussion because Mia's voice called out from the hallway, small and uncertain. "Daddy? You awake?" Joan looked at Carl with wide eyes, clearly terrified of being discovered, of traumatizing his daughter, of destroying the trust Mia had in her. Carl made a split-second decision based on gut instinct and years of knowing his child. Mia could handle more truth than most people gave 5-year-olds credit for, especially when that truth was wrapped in love rather than deception. "Come in, sweetheart," he called out, sitting up and making sure the blanket covered them both appropriately. The door opened slowly, and Mia peeked around it, her eyes widening when she saw Joan in her father's bed. For a moment, nobody spoke, the adults frozen in anticipation of disaster, while the child processed this new development with typical 5-year-old directness. "Is Miss Joan having a sleepover?" Mia asked, her voice more curious than accusatory. "Sort of," Carl said carefully. "Come here, baby. Let's talk about something important." Mia climbed onto the bed with them, settling between her father and Joan with complete trust. Joan looked like she might pass out from anxiety, but Carl took her hand under the blanket, trying to offer reassurance through touch. "Mia, you know how much Daddy cares about you, right?" Carl began. "You're my whole world, my favorite person, my everything." Mia nodded seriously. "I know, Daddy. You tell me all the time." "Good. That's never going to change." But Carl paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes grown-ups care about each other in special ways too. The way I cared about your mommy, and the way I'm starting to care about Miss Joan." Mia looked between them, her young face thoughtful. "Like boyfriend and girlfriend?" "Exactly like that," Carl confirmed. "How do you feel about that?" Mia was quiet for a long moment, processing. Then she turned to Joan with devastating seriousness. "Are you going to be my new mommy?" Joan's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, sweetheart, I could never replace your mommy. She was special and amazing, and she loved you so much. But if it's okay with you, I'd love to be your friend, who maybe is around more often, who cares about you and your daddy very much." Mia considered this, then said with perfect 5-year-old logic, "Can we still make cookies together?" "Always," Joan promised, her voice thick with emotion. "Okay then," Mia decided. "Can we have pancakes now?" The matter settled in her mind with childhood's remarkable adaptability. As Mia scrambled off the bed and ran to get dressed, Carl and Joan looked at each other in amazement. "Did that just happen?" Joan whispered. "Did we just tell your 5-year-old daughter that we're together and she basically gave her blessing over pancakes?" Carl pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "My daughter is wise beyond her years. She knows what love looks like because she's been surrounded by it her whole life, even after her mother died. She sees how you are with her, how I am with you. Kids are a lot more perceptive than adults give them credit for." "But what about everyone else?" Joan asked. "Your family, my family, your friends. People are going to have opinions about the age gap, about me being the babysitter, about how fast this is moving." "Let them have opinions," Carl said firmly. "I've spent 3 years living for everyone else's comfort, making sure Mia was okay, making sure my late wife's family felt included, making sure I looked like I was coping appropriately. I'm done performing grief and responsibility for an audience. If people can't be happy that I found someone who makes me want to live again instead of just survive, that's their problem, not ours." Joan searched his face, looking for certainty she desperately needed to find. "You're sure about this? About us? About making this real instead of keeping it secret?" Carl kissed her properly this time, slow and deep and full of promises. "I've never been more sure of anything that didn't involve my daughter. You've brought light back into this house, Joan. You've reminded me that my life didn't end when my wife died, that I'm allowed to want things again. I'm not going to hide that or apologize for it." From the hallway, Mia's voice called out impatiently, "Daddy! Miss Joan! I'm hungry!" They laughed, the tension breaking into something lighter. Carl got up and pulled on sweatpants and a t-shirt, while Joan borrowed one of his shirts that fell to mid-thigh on her smaller frame. Together, they walked downstairs hand in hand, ready to start this new chapter of their lives with honesty instead of secrecy, with hope instead of fear. The pancakes Carl made that morning were celebrated more for what they represented than their taste. Mia sat at the kitchen table swinging her legs and chattering about her upcoming school project, while Joan helped measure flour and Carl flipped pancakes with practiced ease. To anyone looking through the window, they would have appeared as a family, comfortable and familiar, as if they'd been doing this together for years rather than navigating brand new territory with every interaction. But the reality was more complex than appearances suggested. Over the following weeks, Carl and Joan worked to integrate their relationship into the existing framework of their lives with varying degrees of success. Mia adapted with remarkable speed, treating Joan's increased presence as a natural evolution rather than a disruption. She started calling Joan by her first name more often, dropping the formal miss, and began requesting that Joan participate in bedtime routines and weekend outings that had previously been strictly father-daughter time. The child's acceptance was both a blessing and a source of anxiety for Joan, who constantly worried about overstepping boundaries or inadvertently trying to replace Mia's late mother in ways that might cause harm down the road. Carl's family proved more challenging. His mother, Patricia Bennett, had been his rock during the dark years after his wife's death, moving across 3 states to help with Mia, while Carl figured out how to be a single parent. She'd stayed for 18 months before returning home, satisfied that her son had found his footing. She'd been cautiously supportive when Carl called to tell her about Joan, asking the expected questions about age and intentions and whether Carl had considered how this might affect Mia. But when she visited 2 months into the relationship, Patricia's reservations became more apparent. She was polite to Joan, never overtly rude, but her coolness was unmistakable. During a private conversation in the kitchen while Joan played with Mia in the backyard, Patricia finally voiced her concerns. "She's young, Carl," his mother said carefully, washing dishes with meticulous attention. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with her, but you have to consider what she's sacrificing. She should be out experiencing life, not playing stepmother to your daughter." "Joan's not playing at anything," Carl replied firmly. "And she makes her own choices. I've given her multiple opportunities to walk away, made sure she understands what she's signing up for. She chooses to be here." Patricia sighed, setting down the dish she'd been washing to face her son directly. "I'm worried you're vulnerable, sweetheart. You've been alone so long, been focused on Mia for so long. The first woman who shows interest, who's good with your daughter, of course you're going to develop feelings. But is this real love, or is this loneliness finding the nearest warm body?" Carl felt anger flash through him at the suggestion, but he forced himself to breathe before responding. His mother meant well, came from a place of protection rather than judgment. "Mom, I know the difference between loneliness and love. I loved my wife deeply. I know what that feels like, what it looks like, what it requires. What I feel for Joan isn't some pale substitute or desperate grab at companionship. She challenges me, makes me better, sees me as more than just a grieving widower or a single dad. She's brilliant and kind and patient, and yes, she's younger, but she's not a child. She's a grown woman making informed decisions about her own life." "Have you asked her what she wants?" Patricia pressed. "Really asked her? Because from where I'm standing, she looks at you like you hung the moon, which is lovely, but it also means she might not be evaluating the situation objectively. She might be so caught up in taking care of you and Mia that she's not considering what she's giving up." Before Carl could respond, Joan's voice came from the doorway. They both turned to find her standing there, face flushed but expression determined. She'd clearly heard at least part of the conversation, and rather than retreating in embarrassment, she stepped fully into the kitchen. "Mrs. Bennett, I appreciate your concern," Joan said with quiet dignity. "And you're right to question whether I've thought this through. So let me be clear about something. I'm not here because I don't have other options. I'm not settling for Carl out of some misguided hero complex or because I'm too young to know better. I'm here because when I look at my future, the only version that makes sense, that feels right, includes him and Mia. Yes, I'm 23. Yes, there are experiences I haven't had yet. But you know what I have experienced? Watching my mother stay in a marriage for 30 years with a man who treated her like an accessory, who never really saw her, who provided financial stability but no emotional connection. I grew up watching her shrink herself to fit into someone else's idea of what she should be. And I promised myself I would never do that I would only build a life with someone who saw me as a partner, who valued my thoughts and my contributions, who loved me for who I am, rather than who they needed me to be." She moved further into the room, her voice strengthening with conviction. "Carl sees me. He listens to me. He treats me like an equal, even though we're in different life stages. He's taught me about patience and resilience and what it means to love someone so completely you'd sacrifice everything for their happiness. Being with him and Mia isn't limiting my life. It's expanding it in ways I never knew were possible." Patricia studied Joan for a long moment, reassessing. Finally, her expression softened slightly. "You're stronger than I gave you credit for. I apologize for underestimating you." Joan nodded, accepting the olive branch. "I understand why you're protective of them. They're worth protecting. I just hope eventually you'll trust that I'm worth including in that protection rather than being seen as a threat to it." The conversation marked a turning point. Patricia didn't become Joan's biggest cheerleader overnight, but her opposition softened into watchful acceptance. She began asking Joan's opinion on matters relating to Mia, including her in family decisions, acknowledging her role in Carl's life with increasing grace. By the time Patricia left after her 2-week visit, she hugged Joan with genuine warmth and whispered that Carl and Mia were lucky to have her. Joan's family presented different challenges. Her parents, traditional and conservative, had expected their daughter to pursue career advancement and financial security before settling into domestic life. When Joan told them about Carl over a tense dinner at their suburban home, her father's reaction was immediate and harsh. "He's how old?" Roberto Martinez demanded, setting down his fork with enough force to make the plates rattle. 35? With a child? Mija, what are you thinking? "Daddy, I love him," Joan said, trying to keep her voice calm. "And I love Mia. This is what I want." "You're throwing away your future," her mother Carmen added, disappointment evident in every word. "You have a degree in early childhood education. You could be working at prestigious preschools, building a career, establishing yourself. Instead, you're playing nanny to some man's daughter." "I'm not playing nanny," Joan protested. "I am building a future, just not the one you envisioned for me." Her father shook his head, disgust clear on his face. "This is what happens when you spend too much time with other people's children. You forget you're not actually part of their family. You're the help, Joan. Don't delude yourself into thinking otherwise." The words hit like physical blows, cruel and calculated to wound. Joan felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall, refused to give her father the satisfaction of seeing her break. "Carl isn't like that," she said quietly. "He's never treated me as less than. He respects me, values my input, includes me in decisions about Mia's upbringing. We're building something real together, whether you approve or not." "You're making a mistake," Carmen said, her voice softer than her husband's, but no less convinced. "When this relationship ends, and it will end, you'll be years behind your peers, with nothing to show for it but heartbreak and wasted time." Joan stood, gathering her purse with shaking hands. "I'm sorry you can't be happy for me. I'm sorry my choices don't align with your expectations. But I'm an adult, and this is my life. I hope someday you'll be able to accept that and accept Carl and Mia as part of my life. If not," she paused, the words painful but necessary, "then I guess we don't have much to talk about." She left her childhood home with tears streaming down her face, calling Carl from her car. He answered on the first ring, immediately picking up on her distress. "What happened? Where are you?" "I'm outside my parents' house," Joan managed through tears. "They hate you. They think I'm ruining my life. They called me the help." "Give me your location," Carl said immediately. "I'm coming to get you. You shouldn't drive like this." 20 minutes later, Carl pulled up beside her car. Mia was strapped into her car seat in the back, having been with him when Joan called. Carl got out and pulled Joan into his arms, letting her cry against his chest while he murmured reassurances. "Your parents are wrong," he said firmly, once her tears had slowed. "You're not ruining anything. You're brilliant and capable, and you have your whole life ahead of you, whether that's with me or pursuing something else entirely. If anything, I'm the one who should worry about holding you back." Joan pulled back to look at him, eyes red but determined. "You're not holding me back. You're lifting me up. My parents just can't see that because it doesn't fit their narrow definition of success." From the car, Mia called out, "Miss Joan, are you sad? Can I give you a hug?" Joan laughed through her tears, moving to the car to accept Mia's enthusiastic embrace. The 5-year-old's unconditional affection, her simple belief that hugs could fix most problems, provided comfort that no adult reasoning could match. "We're your family now," Mia announced with absolute certainty. "Right, Daddy?" "That's right, baby," Carl confirmed, his eyes meeting Joan's over his daughter's head. "We're her family." The weeks that followed were difficult, but ultimately strengthening. Joan's relationship with her parents remained strained, limited to brief phone calls that carefully avoided discussing Carl or Mia. It hurt, that lack of acceptance, but it also clarified what truly mattered. She couldn't control their reactions, couldn't force them to see what she saw in Carl and Mia. All she could do was build her own life according to her own values and hope that eventually they'd come around. Meanwhile, her relationship with Carl deepened in ways that went beyond physical attraction or emotional comfort. They learned each other's rhythms, figured out how to navigate disagreements without catastrophizing, discovered that love required constant work and communication, but that the effort was worthwhile when it brought them closer together. They had their first real fight 3 months into officially dating. It started small, a disagreement about how to handle Mia's bedtime routine. Joan thought they were being too lenient, allowing Mia to manipulate them into extra stories and delayed lights out. Carl felt like Joan was being inflexible, trying to impose structure where it wasn't necessary. The argument escalated quickly, both of them bringing up grievances that had been simmering beneath the surface, things neither had felt safe mentioning before. "You're not her mother," Carl snapped at one point, immediately regretting the words but unable to take them back. The hurt that flashed across Joan's face was devastating. She went very still, her voice dangerously quiet when she responded. "You're right. I'm not her mother. I'm just the person who rearranged her entire life to be here, who loves that little girl like she's my own, who has spent every day for the past 6 months trying to support you both without overstepping. But clearly I've failed at maintaining those boundaries." The words hung between them, poisonous and painful. Carl reached for her, but Joan stepped back. "I think I should go," she said. "Give us both some space to calm down before we say things we can't take back." "Don't," Carl said desperately. "Don't leave. We can work through this." Joan shook her head, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I'm not leaving. I just need time to process." "You hit a nerve, Carl. A nerve that's been raw since this relationship started. The constant question of where I fit, whether I'm allowed to have opinions about Mia's upbringing, whether I'll ever be more than just the babysitter who got lucky." She grabbed her purse and keys, moving toward the door. "I'll call you tomorrow. We'll talk when we're both calmer." After she left, Carl stood in his empty living room, feeling like he'd just made the worst mistake of his life. The house felt wrong without Joan in it, cold and hollow in a way it hadn't felt in months. He checked on Mia, who was sleeping peacefully, unaware of the adult drama unfolding around her. Then he sat on the edge of his bed, head in his hands, trying to figure out how to fix what he'd broken. The next morning, Joan's phone rang early. It was Mia, having somehow figured out how to call from Carl's phone. "Miss Joan?" Mia's small voice was worried. "Are you mad at Daddy?" "No, sweetheart," Joan assured her, though her own eyes filled with tears at the sound of the child's voice. "We just had a disagreement. Grown-ups do that sometimes. Are you coming back?" Mia asked. "Because Daddy is really sad, and he made your coffee this morning, even though you weren't here, and that made him even sadder." Joan's heart clenched. "I'm coming back, baby, I promise. Can you put your daddy on the phone?" When Carl's voice came on the line, rough with emotion and lack of sleep, Joan felt her anger dissolving into something softer. "I'm sorry," they both said simultaneously. Carl continued first. "What I said was inexcusable. You are so much more than Mia's babysitter. You're her friend, her role model, someone she trusts completely. And you're my partner, someone whose opinion matters, whose input is valuable, whose place in our lives is secure. I was defensive because you were right, because I have been too lenient with bedtime, because it's easier to give in than to enforce boundaries. But that's not fair to Mia, and it's not fair to you when you're trying to help establish healthy routines." Joan took a shaky breath. "I'm sorry too. I've been so worried about overstepping that when you acknowledged the boundary exists, it triggered all my insecurities. I need to trust that you value my role in Mia's life without constantly seeking validation. And I need to remember that disagreeing about parenting approaches doesn't mean you're diminishing my importance." "Can I come over?" Joan asked. "We should have this conversation face to face." "Please," Carl said. "We're waiting for you." When Joan arrived, Mia launched herself into Joan's arms with 5-year-old exuberance, chattering about how she'd helped Daddy make coffee and how they'd missed her. Carl watched the reunion with visible relief, waiting until Mia went to play in her room before pulling Joan close. They sat on the couch together, hands intertwined, and had the difficult conversations they'd been avoiding. About Joan's fears of never being enough, about Carl's guilt over burdening her with his complicated life, about how to navigate parenting decisions as a team when Joan wasn't technically Mia's parent. "We need to define this," Carl said. "Not just for us, but for Mia. She needs to understand your authority, that when you make decisions about her welfare, those decisions are valid and backed by me." Joan nodded. "And I need to trust that having opinions about her upbringing doesn't make me controlling or overstepping. She's going to be in my life for the foreseeable future. I can't just be a passive observer." They established new ground rules, created systems for communicating about Mia's needs and routines, agreed to present a united front, even when they disagreed privately. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. By the time Mia's 6th birthday rolled around, they'd found their rhythm. The party was small, held in Carl's backyard with a few of Mia's classmates and their parents. Carl handled the grill while Joan orchestrated games and activities, the two of them moving around each other with practiced coordination. At one point, another parent, a woman named Sarah, whose daughter was in Mia's class, pulled Joan aside. "You're really good with her," Sarah observed. "And with Carl. How long have you two been together?" "About 6 months officially," Joan replied, watching Carl help Mia blow out her birthday candles. "You make it look easy," Sarah said. "But I bet it's not, given the situation. Blending families never is." Joan smiled slightly. "We're not technically a blended family. I'm not Mia's stepmother or anything official like that." "But you love her," Sarah stated rather than asked. "And she loves you. That's pretty official where it counts." The comment stayed with Joan through the evening, through the cleanup after guests left, through bath time and bedtime stories. After Mia was asleep, Joan found Carl on the back porch, cleaning up the last of the party debris. "One of the other parents made a comment today," Joan said, settling into the chair beside him, "about how we look like a family." Carl set down the trash bag he'd been filling, giving her his full attention. "What do you think about that?" "Honestly?" Joan paused, gathering her thoughts. "I think we are a family, just not a traditional one. I think Mia is as much mine now as if I'd given birth to her. I think when I imagine my future, it's impossible to picture without both of you in it." Carl moved to kneel in front of her chair, taking her hands in his. "Joan Martinez, I know this started unconventionally. I know there are people who think you're too young, or that I'm taking advantage, or that we're moving too fast. But I've never been more certain of anything in my life than I am about wanting to build a future with you." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box that made Joan's breath catch. "I'm not asking you to be Mia's mother as a replacement for the one she lost. I'm asking you to be her mother going forward, to make this official, to let me wake up next to you every morning instead of watching you leave every night." He opened the box to reveal a simple but beautiful ring. "Will you marry me?" Joan's hands flew to her mouth, tears spilling over as she nodded frantically. "Yes," she managed through happy sobs. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times, yes." Carl slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her down into his arms, holding her like he'd never let go. From the upstairs window, unnoticed by either adult, Mia watched with sleepy satisfaction, giving a small fist pump before toddling back to bed. Her family was complete now, exactly as it should be. The engagement announcement brought varied reactions. Carl's mother was cautiously supportive, acknowledging that Joan had proven herself capable and committed. Some friends were genuinely happy for them. But the most satisfying response came from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after the proposal, Joan's mother called. Her voice was stiff but determined. "Your father isn't ready to talk yet," Carmen said. "But I am. Can I come visit? Meet Carl and Mia properly?" Joan agreed, nervous but hopeful. The visit was awkward at first. Carmen clearly uncomfortable in an environment so different from what she'd envisioned for her daughter. But watching Joan interact with Mia, seeing the gentle way Carl treated her daughter, observing the genuine happiness radiating from Joan, something shifted in Carmen's understanding. At the end of the visit, Carmen hugged Joan tightly. "I still think you're young," she admitted, "and I still worry about you taking on so much responsibility. But I can see you love them, and more importantly, I can see they love you back in ways that honor who you are. Maybe that's enough." It was the beginning of reconciliation, not perfect, but promising. As the wedding planning began, Joan made peace with the fact that some people would never fully approve of their unconventional start. But those people didn't matter as much as the family they were actively creating, the life they were building together through conscious choice and constant effort. 6 months later, Joan walked down the makeshift aisle in Carl's backyard, Mia serving as flower girl with solemn dedication. The ceremony was small and intimate, focused on the promises they were making rather than the spectacle of the event. When Carl lifted her veil to kiss her, Joan felt the rightness of this moment settle into her bones. This was what she'd been searching for without knowing it. This man, this child, this complicated and beautiful and imperfect family. The reception was joyful and chaotic, filled with dancing and laughter and Mia's insistence that she got to stay up late because it was a special occasion. As the night wound down and guests departed, Carl and Joan stood together watching Mia dance with Patricia, the child's energy seemingly inexhaustible despite the late hour. "Thank you," Carl said quietly, pulling Joan close, "for choosing us, for staying when it got hard, for loving my daughter like she's yours." "Our daughter," Joan corrected gently. "We're a family now, official and everything." Carl kissed her temple, breathing in the scent of her hair, marveling at how far they'd come from that afternoon in his office when everything had changed. Sometimes the best things in life started with mistakes, with boundary crossings, with impossible attractions that defied logic. Sometimes love didn't wait for permission or perfect timing. Sometimes it simply showed up in your life wearing a nervous smile and asking if you needed printer paper, and all you could do was hold on tight and hope you were brave enough to deserve it. As they helped an exhausted Mia up to bed, the three of them together performing the nighttime routine that had become sacred, Joan caught sight of their reflection in the hallway mirror. A black man with silver starting to show at his temples, a young white woman with joy written across her features, and a beautiful biracial child held between them. They didn't look like what society expected, but they looked right, looked whole, looked exactly like what a family should be. That night, after Mia was asleep and the house was finally quiet, Carl and Joan lay tangled together in the bed that was now officially theirs, talking about the future in soft whispers. About the possibility of giving Mia a sibling, about Joan returning to school for her master's degree, about Carl eventually cutting back his hours to spend more time at home, about all the ordinary and extraordinary moments that lay ahead. "I can't believe you were my babysitter 6 months ago," Carl mused, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on Joan's shoulder. "It feels like you've always been part of our lives." Joan smiled against his chest. "I can't believe I was terrified you'd fire me for being in your office that day. Best terrible idea I ever had." "Best terrible idea we ever had," Carl corrected. "We were both taking risks." Joan propped herself up on one elbow to look at him properly. "Do you have any regrets about how this started? About the complications?" Carl considered the question seriously, knowing she deserved honesty. "I regret the judgment we've faced, the difficulty with your family, the moments when you've had to defend our relationship to people who should support you. But the relationship itself? Choosing you? Building this family? Those are the best decisions I've ever made besides Mia." Joan kissed him softly. "Good answer." They made love slowly, tenderly, celebrating the commitment they'd formalized that day, but also simply enjoying each other with the comfort of knowing this wasn't temporary, wasn't forbidden, wasn't something they had to hide. They'd survived the scrutiny, navigated the complications, and emerged with something real and lasting. The next morning, Joan woke to Mia bouncing on the bed between them, announcing that it was pancake day, and that now that Joan was officially family, she had to learn Daddy's secret recipe. As the three of them headed downstairs together, Joan felt overwhelming gratitude for the courage that had brought her to this moment. For the photograph that had started everything, for the attraction she hadn't denied, for the risk Carl had taken in letting her into his heart and his daughter's life. Some people would always see their story as scandalous, inappropriate, a cautionary tale about power dynamics and age gaps and moving too fast. But those people didn't know what Joan knew, had never felt what she felt every time Carl looked at her like she was his miracle, every time Mia called her mom with casual certainty, every time she woke up in this house that had become her home. Love didn't always arrive with perfect timing or ideal circumstances. Sometimes it showed up messy and complicated and absolutely worth fighting for. Sometimes it asked you to be brave when being cautious would be easier. Sometimes it demanded you trust your heart over other people's opinions. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, it gave you everything you never knew you needed. A family built on choice rather than obligation. A partnership based on mutual respect and genuine desire. A future bright with possibility instead of limited by fear. Joan had found all of that and more in the arms of a man who'd been looking for someone to see him, in the home of a child who'd been needing someone to love her, in the life she'd built by refusing to apologize for wanting what she wanted. As she stood at the stove making pancakes with Carl's arms around her waist and Mia's chatter filling the kitchen, Joan smiled at the beautiful mess they'd created together. This was what happiness looked like. Complicated and imperfect and absolutely worth every risk they'd taken to find it.